Well, good evening, everybody. I am not Dave, as you can see, and so I am picking up again to teach for a little while, and he'll be back when we're done with this one, I think. So now Kay alerted me that you guys have been opening by singing a hymn. I'm going to let Dave, that be his thing. So we're going to open with a hymn, but I do want to open with any prayer requests that you might have, anything we can be praying about.
October 1st.
Okay, what's October 1st?
Adoption happens.
Oh, okay.
Out in Arizona. Yep.
Big praise.
And what's the name of the baby or child?
The two little girls is Maddie and Mally.
They're 4 and 3. And we can, any prayer warriors who want to do it, it's going to be a Zoom call, and they can, what's that? Virtual, yeah, and so you can log on and watch it.
So when we get the link.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
We have a praise, we have a new great grandson who was born Sunday evening. He's out in Colorado. So when does your flight leave?
And what's his name?
Anderson Wayne. Wayne was his grandfather who died when our son-in-law was only 9 months old when his dad died.
Oh, wow.
That was his dad's name.
Okay.
And then the Anderson was apparently a grandfather or great-grandfather somewhere.
Good family name. Anything else? All right, well, let's pray. God, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for this time to study and talk together over your word, and just pray that it would be a blessing to us as we start this new study today. We want to just give you praise for this adoption of Maddie and Mally, and just are so excited for this family that they're going to be joining, and just pray that you continue to guide this process as they get closer to that date of October 1st, and just that your hand would be upon it. And just thank you for that blessing. And also want to just give you praise for little Anderson, and just thank you for bringing him into this world, and just pray for his mom and dad and the family, just as they over the next few weeks just get into the raising a newborn, but also just in the coming years to just bring him up and just pray your blessing upon his life, and just grateful for just new life and the celebration that brings to us. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, we are starting a series tonight in Jeremiah. And so for those of you that were with our Revelation series, it's not going to be quite as intense as that. Probably more discussion-oriented as we talk through this book. We're going to be doing a video series. We've done those before. The gentleman doing it is John Kehrer. He's a Old Testament professor at Ozark Christian College. We've not done any of his stuff before, but I think you'll be encouraged by him. Really, our goal of this is, the subtitle of the series is Finding God in Chaos. And I thought, just looking at our world today, and especially as we get closer to November, I think chaos is a great way to describe a lot of what we see. And so how we stay focused on God in the midst of that. And I think this is going to be an encouragement to us in that regard. I did want to start tonight. I won't do this every week, but I did want to start tonight just since we're covering the first chapter of just reading Jeremiah 1. It's not very long, but I think it will give us a good running start to understand as our discussion tonight. And I will encourage you, it is a longer book. I had you read Revelation probably a few times as we did that series. This is longer than Revelation, but I do think it would still be a great thing if you take some time over the next couple of weeks to read through this. You won't probably understand all of it. That's the nature of prophecy a little bit, but I think it will be a good exercise so that as we come together, we have an understanding of the background of what's going on in this book. So I just wanted to encourage you to do that right up at the top of our study here. So I'm going to read from Jeremiah 1, and then we'll jump into the video and have some time of discussion. It says, "The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anatoth, in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. The word of the Lord came to me, this is Jeremiah talking, came to Jeremiah saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. The Lord said to me, You have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a pot that is boiling, I answered. It is tilting toward us from the north. The Lord said to me, From the north disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord. Their kings will come and set up their thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. They will come against all her surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. I will pronounce my judgments on people because of their wickedness and forsaking me, and burning incense to other gods, and in worshiping what their hands have made. Get yourself ready. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you, but will not overcome you. For I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord.
Have you ever lived through chaos? Have you ever lived through trauma? An experience that was so disorienting, so jarring that it changed the way that you saw all of life. In many ways, the book of Jeremiah comes to us at just that place. Jeremiah is a bit of an anomaly in our Old Testament. In our Old Testament, it comes after the book of Isaiah, and even though it has not as many chapters as Isaiah or as many chapters as the book of Psalms, it still falls right there afterwards. But in Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament, Jeremiah is actually the longest book in all the Old Testament. It has more Hebrew words in it than any other one. And those words are full of weeping and mourning. Jeremiah is often called the mourning prophet or the weeping prophet. He's also associated with the book of Lamentations, which is just story after story, poem after poem of the devastation that hit Jerusalem in the days after King Nebuchadnezzar came and took away the exiles into Babylon. And so the book of Jeremiah reads much like a primer on what happens when you live through chaos. What happens when you live through the pain of excruciating trauma. And so Jeremiah gives us the details of how God walks with his people through times even like that. In many ways, chapter 1 of Jeremiah details the call of Jeremiah into ministry, but after that, after we leave chapter 1, it sort of propels us into this chaotic life of Jeremiah. The book itself is actually not chronological. Some of the sections seem to happen earlier in ministry, early on in the book. And then there's some other sections as we get later in the book that do seem to happen later on in Jeremiah's ministry. But strictly speaking, the book of Jeremiah is not a chronological retelling of the way that the events occurred in Jeremiah's life. Instead, we'll get snippets. Here's a story of what happened, and then here's another story of what happened, and here's another story of what happened. But the chapter numbers of those stories are not necessarily in chronological life order. Also, we'll get stories of Jeremiah's parables or Jeremiah's enacted metaphors of what God thinks about his people and what he's going to do with his people. But the reality is, those stories, those parables, those metaphors may have been given at different points in Jeremiah's life. And again, not necessarily in chronological order. We see the city of Jerusalem fall multiple times in the book of Jeremiah, not because it did fall multiple times. It just means we get several tellings of the same event. One comes towards the end of the book, but when one comes in the very last chapter of the book. In fact, if you've ever tried to just read through Jeremiah, it actually can feel pretty disorienting. You're reading through and you're like, wait a second, didn't we just talk about this? And wait a second, wasn't Jeremiah doing this? And now why is he doing this? And how does this fit here? And how does this fit here? And how do all of these pieces fit together? And I think the book of Jeremiah actually feels a little bit like what I imagine Jeremiah the person might have been a little bit like. A little disoriented, a little bit just confused at all of this chaos that was happening around him. In many ways, I think the structure of the book of Jeremiah is sort of a picture of what happens when life is in chaos. And so, let's begin our study of the book of Jeremiah here in Jeremiah chapter 1. The words of Jeremiah, it says, verse 1, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests living in Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. So this helps us place Jeremiah as one of the priests. He serves the Lord. That's part of his family business. And he lives in Anathoth, but he will not stay there. In fact, his ministry throughout the book of Jeremiah happens mostly in Jerusalem. He travels a little bit as he goes throughout his ministry, ends up leaving Jerusalem at several points, but by and large, Jeremiah's ministry consists of focusing in on the city of Jerusalem, giving a message to the people of God living in the land of Judah. Here's what it says in verse 2. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. It also came throughout the days of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. You know, I think at this point it's helpful for us to begin to understand exactly what happened with the kings of Judah. Now, if you ever have read through the Old Testament book of Kings, you've surely been a little bit puzzled by all of the different kings of Israel and Judah as they come through. And it's a little bit difficult to follow at times which king is reigning and how long are they reigning and which kingdom are they reigning over. So I think it might be helpful for us here at the beginning to just back up a little bit, and ask the question, where does this fall in the history of Judah? So I just want to talk through several of the kings of Judah so that we can get a better handle on what exactly is happening in the book of Jeremiah. The first king I want to talk about is King Uzziah. King Uzziah reigned in the days of Isaiah. If you remember, Isaiah's sort of prophecy, his call into ministry came in the year that King Uzziah died. Uzziah actually had a 50-year reign, and there was relative stability during his lifetime. Overall, he was a pretty good king, although he made some questionable choices. He tried to offer a sacrifice on the altar in Jerusalem, and that did not go well. He ended up breaking out in leprosy and had to spend the rest of his days living somewhere else. But overall, Uzziah was a good king. Isaiah's prophecies began in the year that King Uzziah died, and his son Jotham took the throne. Now, Jotham did not reign for very long. Jotham just reigned for a couple of years altogether. And we actually don't know much about Jotham's reign. After Jotham, though, came Ahaz. Ahaz was not a good king. Ahaz was one of the worst kings, in fact, of all of Israel and Judah. Ahaz ended up sacrificing his son to foreign pagan deities. He built a copy of the Assyrian altar in the temple at Jerusalem. He was one of the worst kings. He led the people deep into idolatry and pagan, turning away from the Lord. And this was a terrible period in Israel's history. Much of the prophecies of Isaiah happened during the reign of King Ahaz. After Ahaz, his son Hezekiah came to power. Hezekiah actually was a good king. In fact, he was one of the best kings of Judah. Hezekiah reigned during the period when the Assyrians were really taking over more and more and more territory. And in fact, the Assyrian threat was weighing pretty heavily on Hezekiah and on Jerusalem. It's during Hezekiah's days that the Assyrians actually even make it all the way up to Jerusalem. And they're ready to attack Jerusalem. They send messengers into the city to try to get the people to surrender. It's a very critical time for the people of Judah. But what does Hezekiah do? In the face of the Assyrian threat, he turns to God. He turns to Yahweh, and he pleads for help. God answers his prayer, and miraculously, God saves the people. And so Hezekiah was a good king. However, after Hezekiah comes Manasseh. Manasseh was one of the worst kings in all of the history of Judah. Manasseh also had a very long reign, which I think only exacerbated how terrible his reign really was. He built not just one altar, but several altars, pagan altars, in the temple in Jerusalem. And also, he sacrificed his son in the fire, just like his grandfather Ahaz had done. He led the people further into pagan idolatry, and he was a terrible, terrible king. However, there was some stability during his reign. 50 years he was on the throne or so, and then his son Amon took over. Amon reigned for only about 2 years, a pretty short reign, and then his son Josiah came to the throne. Josiah is one of the most popular kings of ancient Judah, and he was also a good king, much like Hezekiah. It's during the days of Josiah that as they're doing work in the temple of the Lord, as they're sort of trying to rebuild and restore some of the temple, they find the book of the law. Apparently, during the days of Manasseh and during the days of Amon, these books had been lost. People were not reading from the law on a regular basis, and they'd sort of been buried away or put away and forgotten. And so they uncover the book of the law, which is probably something like the book of Deuteronomy, and they read from it, and the people realize what they've done. Josiah realizes how far they've come, and because of the reading of the book of the law, Josiah institutes all of these reforms to purge the land of idolatry. Josiah goes through and smashes down pagan altars. He smashes all of these altars or idols, and he really cleanses the land of so much of this pagan idolatry. However, Josiah's reign, at the end of Josiah's reign, he tries to go up against Egypt, and he is killed by the Egyptians in battle. And so it's during the reign of Josiah that Jeremiah receives his call, that he enters into ministry. And after Josiah, then his son Jehoahaz comes to power. During the reign of Josiah, towards the end of his reign, right, the Egyptians are gaining more power, and they're trying to take over more of the region. And so once they kill Josiah in battle, then really they're kind of controlling things in the land of Judah. And so Jehoahaz actually only ends up reigning for about 3 months, and then he is taken away to Egypt. He was not a good king in those 3 months, I guess as evil as you could be in 3 months of reigning, but then he's taken away to Egypt, and so he's no longer on the throne. After that, Josiah's next son, Eliakim, comes to the throne, and he ends up taking on the throne name Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim ends up reigning for 11 years, and he is not a good king either. Nebuchadnezzar beats Egypt during his reign, and so this is bad news for Judah. And Jehoiakim is trying to figure out how to make sense of life and how to lead his people through this difficult time. Towards the end of his reign, he switches his allegiance from Egypt to Babylon, but then he ends up changing his mind and switching back. And as you can imagine, that did not go well. The Babylonians come in and attack. And we actually don't know how Jehoiakim died, but it does say that he got a donkey's burial, which I think was not a way to say that he was honored in his burial or honored in his death. He had an evil reign, and it did not end well. And so Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin, he ends up coming to power, and he reigns there in Jerusalem, but again, only for a very short period of time. He ends up being exiled to Babylon by the Babylonians, and he lives out his days living in exile in the land of Babylon. Because the Babylonians have taken away Jehoiachin, now they decide to put somebody else on the throne. And so what they do is they actually go back and find another son of Josiah, whose name is Zedekiah, and they place him on the throne. Zedekiah ends up being the last king of Judah. He's the one who will lead the people straight away into exile. And overall, Zedekiah is not a good king. He's lukewarm to the Babylonians, despite Jeremiah's words all throughout his ministry to turn to the Babylonians, to surrender to the Babylonians. He doesn't want to do this at all. Finally, he decides, you know what, I'm just going to rebel against Babylon altogether. And because of that, the Babylonians decide to come and attack Jerusalem once and for all, and they put the city under siege, and after a short time, they're able to overcome the city and defeat Zedekiah. And so, the story of the history of Judah is one of this downward spiral, it seems, where the people get closer and closer to the edge. God continues to call out to them. God continues to warn them against this path that they're headed down, but they refuse to listen. As we get towards the end of Judah's history, God actually says multiple times through the prophecies of Jeremiah, just surrender to Babylon. Just surrender to Babylon. Give in to Babylon. But the people, they're so hesitant to do it. They don't want to do it because surrender sounds so terrible to them. John Goldengay tells the fable of a man who fell off the edge of a cliff, and as he was falling, he grabbed onto a tree root. And so there he is, dangling over the edge of the cliff, and he's crying out, "Somebody help me! Somebody help me!" Finally, after he's hanging there for a while and he's calling out, all of a sudden he hears this voice from heaven, "Just let go, and I will save you." Silence. And then the man says, "Is there anybody else?" Letting go can indeed be a scary proposition, especially when you're letting go into the hands of your enemy, and that enemy is Babylon. Yeah, that seems exactly what God is asking the people to do. They refuse, and then they experience the consequences of their choices. Zedekiah ends up being captured. His sons are killed before his eyes. He's taken away to Babylon, and he dies. Meanwhile, the commander enters the temple in Jerusalem. He burns Jerusalem to the ground, and it's a devastating loss for the people of Judah. So, what are we to make of all of these words, the story of the kings of Judah? Well, Kathleen O'Connor says that trauma has a way of disorienting us. Disasters have a way of ruining foundations in life, of overturning routine. And survivors of disaster, particularly, have fragmented memories. They have their language that sort of breaks down at points. They become numb. They lose faith. And in many ways, the stories they tell as they reflect on the disaster that happened to them or the chaos that happened to them, especially when it's not processed, those stories can be very disjointed. In many ways, I think that's what happens in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, in some ways, is a case study in trauma. It is not a tidy or polished book like some of the other books of the Old Testament. It is not a carefully thought out tome of how we are to think about God in this specific time or in this specific age. Instead, it seems to come to us as this almost chaotic anthology of real life. Jeremiah reads like a real life account, of what it's like to live through chaos and trauma. And I think because of that, there's an invitation to us to find meaning. I just want us to read through a few more of these verses in this session. Verse 4, the word of the Lord then came to me. This is to Jeremiah. I chose you, God says. Before I formed you in the womb, I set you apart before you were born. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And Jeremiah says, but I protested, oh no, Lord God. Look, I don't know how to speak. I'm only a youth. And then the Lord said to me, don't say I'm only a youth, for you will go to everyone I send you to, and you will speak whatever I tell you. Don't be afraid of anyone, for I will be with you to rescue you. This is the Lord's declaration. Verse 9, then the Lord reached out his hand, and he touched my mouth. And he told me, I have now filled your mouth with my words. See, I have appointed you today over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and to tear down, to destroy and to demolish, to build and plant. This will be Jeremiah's troubling task. He will be given the job of both uprooting, of both tearing down and building and planting. These are the tasks of Jeremiah in his ministry, to prophesy the devastation that is coming to the land of Judah and also to other nations. We'll get there as well, but also to prophesy the hope that remains for the people who remain devoted to God. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I replied, I see a branch of an almond tree. Verse 12, the Lord said, you've seen correctly. I watch over my word to accomplish it. Then the Lord said to me again, what do you see? And I said, I see a boiling pot, its lip tilted from the north to the south. And then the Lord said to me, yes, disaster will be poured out from the north on all who live in the land. Indeed, I am about to summon all the clans and the kingdoms of the north. This is the Lord's declaration. They will come. Each king will set up his throne at the entrance to Jerusalem's gates. They will attack all her surrounding walls and all the other cities of Judah. You know, verse 16 goes on to detail just exactly how terrible it will be. I will pronounce my judgments against them for all the evil they did when they abandoned me to burn incense to other gods and to worship the works of their hands. Now get ready, Jeremiah. Stand up and tell them everything that I command you. Don't be intimidated by them, or I will cause you to cower before them. Today I am the one who has made you a fortified city, an iron pillar and bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the population. They will fight against you, but never prevail over you, since I am with you to rescue you. This is the Lord's declaration. I do not envy the task that was set before Jeremiah, the call that was placed on him to declare destruction and devastation to this people he loved. But I think there's a powerful word in Jeremiah chapter 1. It's that even though God's people are headed for disaster, even though they are going down this path that will end up in their destruction, God is right there with them. God is walking alongside of them all along the way as they head into trauma. And I think the message of Jeremiah chapter 1 is that God is present, God is with them, and he will continue to be with them in the midst of it all. You know, there's no real word of hope or joy that we can speak to people who live through unspeakable trauma. But I think just the fact that God is with his people, that God doesn't abandon them or leave them altogether, that he continues to walk with them, even on dark and lonely roads, I think can be a great encouragement for us. And I hope that can be a word that encourages you today from the book of Jeremiah.
All right, so like I said, there's a bit of a running start we have to get with some of that history, but I think that really drew me into this series of looking at all those leaders and the hope that was put in them over and over again and how often they fell short. And I think that's something for us to remember, like I said, as we go into this season of our leaders and our politics. But outside of that, I also want to look at just this call on Jeremiah, this call that he receives from God. I'm going to skip question 1 just for the sake of time and go right to question 2. What about this text or about Jeremiah's call resonated with you?
What he's going to do, what he's supposed to do, you know?
What else? What else stood out to you about this call? Yeah, John.
I think it just shows that God has us at a particular place, that all of us that are here now, we're supposed to be here now. This is our time. And this was his time to give God's message to the people to repent, even though they ignored him.
Yeah. The verse 5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. I thought that just, that really stood out of the heaviness of this call. And I resonated that with that a little bit too, just being in ministry and being called to ministry and just how there's this task, this weightiness that God put before him. And even in the midst of that too, toward the end where he talks about, I made you a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land. That Jeremiah is probably going to go into this feeling pretty isolated, feeling pretty alone in this task, and yet God has told him, hey, I'm making you, this indestructible force of my will to go out and to do what I've called you to do. And so I think there's a lot of encouragement for us as Christians here that we don't go alone. And as we minister to people and speak truth and even unpopular truths, there's this sense that God goes with us and fortifies us and strengthens us for that task. John spoke a lot about this idea of trauma or loss being disorienting. Can you relate to a loss or trauma as being a disorienting moment in your life? I know it's a very personal question, but if you wouldn't mind sharing an opportunity or a moment where you felt that kind of disorienting, is there a time in your life where that loss or trauma has led to something like that?
Again, when Ernie had his widowmaker, and we did not think he was going to make it, and we learned to do things, and I was a caregiver, and we were away from family, and it was we really did depend on the Lord to lead and guide us.
When my husband died, I couldn't read it. I thought that was unusual. It took probably 2 months before I could even read one verse of the Bible. The letters just did not go together and make words.
We shouldn't be afraid because it's always the ugly times that draw us closer to God.
True. Yeah, I think that those are the times that nobody wants to go through them, but I think looking back, if you were to make a timeline of your life, those moments are probably the moments where we depended on God the most and probably grew the most. I thought of my grandma with this idea of disorienting. When my grandpa died, one of the pieces of advice she got was to sit in his chair instead of her chair, because then she's not looking over at his empty chair. And I just thought, because you're not getting that disorienting sight of an empty chair next to you. And I just thought that is a small thing of just seeing an empty place. How disorienting that can be in a moment of loss and something like that. So John talked a lot about this idea of God going with Jeremiah, walking alongside of them. How would our lives be different if we really believed, and I think we do believe this, but if we truly lived out this idea that God walks with us in the midst of our pain? What would that look like?
We'd be a different country.
Okay.
We've got peace.
Peace, yeah. What else?
To be confident, that if you feel like he's guiding you into doing something for him in his kingdom, that he's going to do things to help it happen.
Yeah. And I think that idea of confidence is probably something Jeremiah, I can't psychoanalyze him, but he probably struggled with that at times because, he's kind of being told here a little bit, like, you're going to you're going to have this ministry that's not going to be super successful. You know, I mean, in the sense of people are not going to be like Billy Graham just streaming down the aisles to come to know God. It's going to be an uphill fight, and a lot of his words are going to fall on deaf ears. And there's probably moments in his life where he had this idea of, you know, lack of peace or a lack of confidence. Like, I think, you know, I've been really blessed in this season of being at SLCC that our church is growing, and I think things are going really well, and that's always an awesome experience. But I think, you know, if you're in an experience where people that are just as faithful, doing the same work that I'm doing, or maybe in a different context, and the church isn't growing, and those kind of things, you probably have this sense of like, what am I doing wrong, or, you know, am I doing something that is God not with me in this process, kind of thing. And I think that a lot of times, especially in those moments of pain or loss or trauma, or just when things are hard, that we have this idea that God is not walking with us. And so when we believe that, we have that confidence that even if it doesn't look like on the outside that things are being blessed or things are going well, that God's still with us. One of the things that John mentioned is this idea of surrendering to Babylon. And that sounds weird to us because we know what happened when Israel fell into exile and captivity in Babylon. But I also think, you know, that might have looked like a completely different process had the people let go and surrendered, because obviously God is calling them to do that, and they didn't do that. And I think a lot of what they struggled with is because of their not letting go. But what do we often struggle to let go of? Even if we feel like God is telling us to release that, to let go of that, what are the things that we often cling to and have a hard time letting go of?
Ourselves and our pride.
Say it again.
It's ourselves and our pride.
Our pride?
Sometimes you have to, I like the saying that Phil Roberts said, is that you have to come to the end of yourself before you can find Jesus.
Yeah.
The what ifs,
What do you mean?
just like the what ifs, like anything. Like you might have a little fear or something.
Okay.
Like maybe November, right? What if?
Sure. Okay.
I was just going to say control.
Yeah. I think especially, I'm sure everybody wants control, but I think especially in our culture, in our society, we have this sense of independence, and then we want some more than others, but really want control and security and those kind of things. It's interesting, whenever we take a plane ride, Kelsey is a nervous flyer. She hates flying. I feel like I get like claw marks in my arms. And for me, it's funny because it's like if I have a little bit of control, it almost makes me more anxious than if I had no control. And so like when I'm flying, it's like, well, I don't know how to fly a plane. He's going to do it for me. And I'm just going to, if it nosedives, it nosedives. But so sometimes I think for me, but if I'm driving like on a long distance trip, that makes me more nervous than flying because I have a little bit of control. And so I think sometimes there's this idea of, we understand that we don't have control of everything, but we want to control the pieces of what we do have. And that's really hard to let go of, especially when it seems like everything around us is in chaos or everything around us is uncertain. And so I think sometimes we have that illusion of control when we really don't control that much. And so it's better just to let go of it completely and trust God in the midst of that. So
I think we're short-sighted too. Jeremiah is only seeing what's happening right in front of him.
Sure.
And the people of Israel only are seeing what's happening in front of them, so they're short-sighted. And we as people, we're short-sighted as well. We have blinders on because we're in the moment of what we're living rather than seeing the perspective of what could be or what is to come. Whereas, God is sovereign and he sees all things. And it's hard because we're just living in the moment.
And I think especially if we talk in terms of trauma or loss, like that can be such an insurmountable, we already are short-sighted, but that on top of it just makes it like that's all you can focus on, that's all you can see is that wall of hardship. And I think, that's a really common experience but then like Ed was saying, looking back, it's those moments that we finally God got us over that wall that we see and so, the idea of hindsight's 20/20, and that's something that when we first moved to Indiana, anytime we move states or all over the place, there's this time of transition. And one of the first sermons I preached there was called God in the Move, because I wanted to see how God was at work. It's easy to look back and see how God was at work, but I want to try to, the best I could, see how God was at work in those moments. And so I think that's something that is good perspective to try to have in the midst of these moments of, it's incredibly difficult, or there's a time of loss or trauma. It's incredibly hard, but understanding that there's life after that. And I think that's what allows us to be encouraged and to have hope, is that even in the midst of that difficulty, there's still God's going to come through for us in the midst of that. So, as we wrap up, I have just a couple of things. There's a kind of homework, if you will. There's no grade or you don't have to say whether or not you did these. But if you are looking for something to help you out this week, there's two things that I want to encourage you to do. The first is to consider adding an alarm to your phone. Just a time. One of the things that's kind of hallmark of prayer is if you don't make time for it, it probably won't happen. And the people I think that have the best prayer lives have, I'm going to pray in the mornings when I wake up, or I'm going to pray at night before I go to bed. This is similar to that, but at a time, or a designated time, sometime this week, every day this week, to remind you to meditate on the presence of God in your life. There's a little bit going back to what Tina was just saying, is being short-sighted. I think these kind of moments of meditating on God's presence allows us to be a little more long-sighted, if that's far-sighted, I guess. Not long-sighted. Far-sighted in how we see God at work. And I think especially in terms of this idea of finding God in the chaos and finding God in the midst of the turmoil, just focusing on his presence with us and what he does in our lives can be a really faith-building experience for us. The other thing I want you to do is read Psalm 23. This is probably a common one to you if you've been in church any length of time. You've, I'm sure, read Psalm 23 before. Many of you probably have it memorized from when you were a little one in church, and that's awesome. But I want to look at how this text speaks to God's presence with his people in the midst of difficult times. One of the things I often say at funerals, and so if you were ever at a funeral that I'm leading, you might hear me say this, but Psalm 23 is interesting because he starts out talking about God in the third person. And in other words, he's describing who God is. And about halfway through, he switches to talking about God in the second person, which means he goes to talking about you. And so I think Psalm 23 is especially helpful for us in seeing God with his people in the midst of difficult times, because we go from this head knowledge of God to actually experiencing God's presence. And you see that just in the language used. And so I want to encourage you, maybe combine these two. At that time of meditation, you read Psalm 23. But just as an opportunity to look at God's presence and seek God's presence and meditate on his presence in the midst of chaos and difficulty and uncertainty. So, any other questions or comments before we wrap up tonight?
Well, when you looked at how God chose him in the womb and even before he was born, so he knew that, but he still had to say yes to the choosing. I mean, God said, now, I'm going to tell you what to say. And he still had to do that. I mean, just because God said go do it doesn't mean it's that easy.
Yeah. And I think you'll see, if you do read Jeremiah, how much difficulty he had to go through.
Right.
That's what's interesting about his call, is it wasn't like, I'm calling you to this incredibly fruitful and excellent opportunity that you're going to just love every moment of it. In fact, it was pretty much the opposite. That this is going to be an uphill battle and a struggle. But I think that is important for us to remember, that even in the midst of hardship, that God can still use us, and even if it doesn't look successful in terms of progress, that we're being faithful to what he has called us to do. And I think that we see that in Jeremiah, this faithfulness, even in the midst of this uphill battle of ministry that he experiences. So, appreciate that. Anything else before we wrap up?
I thought it was interesting that last week David passed out that timeline with the kings, and that fit into the class tonight. It was like he kind of did that, and it's going to be a while until we're back with it or whatever.
I didn't even know you did that, so it's just the Holy Spirit getting those things.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you being here tonight, and hope to see you again next week. And I'll see you on Sunday, but also hope to see you here again next week. So, have a great night.